There were several great performances in Week 1 from a fantasy perspective, and players like Tom Brady and Patrick Mahomes got theirs like they were expected to. Other players like James Conner and Sony Michel simply couldn't get it going and had not so great performances on opening weekend. There were also some good stat lines from a lot of players that weren't expected to have the weeks that they did. Players like Sammy Watkins and Marquise Brown each had over 140 yards and multiple touchdowns. But can they continue that into Week 2? In this video, I will predict 5 fantasy players that will have a bad week compared to their first game that they had. Before we get started though, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel, as all support is very much appreciated. Now with that being said, let's begin. The first player that I think regresses from their Week 1 performance is Bengals quarterback Andy Dalton. Dalton had his first 400-yard game of his career in Week 1 against the Seahawks in his 9th season. He also completed the most passes in his career in a single game with 35. The Bengals attempted 51 passes, and I don't think that's what first-year coach Zach Taylor intends to do every game, as that would lead to Andy Dalton attempting over 800 passes over the course of a season. The 49ers, granted they played turnover-prone Jameis Winston in Week 1, but gave up only 194 passing yards. There has to be some give and take here, and while I think Andy Dalton can certainly pass for more than 194 yards, he's definitely not in for the game he had in Week 1. I also think the 49ers will shut down John Ross and bring him back to earth after his first career 100-yard game. If Joe Mixon plays Sunday, then Andy Dalton will almost certainly be a fantasy dud after his Week 1 performance. Moving on to the next player that I think regresses from their Week 1 performance is Redskins quarterback Case Keenum. Case Keenum surprised everyone in the fantasy world in Week 1 as he threw for 380 yards and 3 touchdowns against an Eagles defense that a lot of people think is near the top of the league. However, I don't think he has the same type of day in Week 2 as he had in Week 1. 2 of his 3 touchdowns were longer than 40 yards, and while a big play like that may happen once or in this case twice in a game, it cannot be relied on week in and week out. The Eagles also did a good job of bottling up Darius Geis in Week 1 as he averaged 1.8 yards per carry in his NFL debut. Adrian Peterson will be playing this week, and I expect the Cowboys to try and stop Adrian early and force Case to beat them. Week 1 is not the most accurate representation of what team seasons will look like, and I think this is an example of that. According to CBS Sports, Case had 33 fantasy points, and I'll be surprised if he has 20 this week against the Cowboys. I expect Case to have a relatively average stat line against Dallas of something around 220 yards and a single touchdown compared to 3 in Week 1. Moving on to the next player that I think regresses in Week 2 is Ravens rookie receiver Marquise Brown. First off, I want to say I love Hollywood Brown and think he's going to have a very successful career for the Ravens, and that him and Lamar will be a great duo for years to come. For this video's purpose though, I don't think Hollywood will have a great Week 2 as he's coming off a 147-yard 2-touchdown performance. To put this into perspective as to how good of a game he actually had, Falcons wide receiver Julio Jones has only done this in a game 3 times in his entire career, and people consider him to be the best in the NFL. In addition to this, Hollywood played only 12 snaps, and while I do think he will be a bigger part of the offense in terms of plays per game soon, he's not going to play every snap and be a part of every receiving play against the Cardinals. I think Hollywood stays under 80 yards and out of the engine for Week 2. Moving on to the next player that I think regresses this week is Eagles wide receiver Deshaun Jackson. Deshaun Jackson had quite the return to Philly in his first game as an Eagle in nearly 6 years. He had 8 catches for 154 yards and 2 touchdowns and was a big reason the Eagles won after recovering from a 17-point deficit early on. However, I don't think he repeats his success in Week 2 against the Falcons for a few reasons. In 7 career games against them, he averages 3.4 catches per game and 48 yards per game. The only touchdown he has scored against the Falcons in his career came back in 2010 when he was just 23 years old. The problem with starting Deshaun Jackson in fantasy this year is the strength of the team he's on. The Eagles have weapons in the receiving game that will steal his looks, such as Alshon Jeffrey, Nelson Aguilar, tight ends Zach Ertz and Dallas Goedert, and running backs Mike Sanders and Jordan Howard. The Eagles have weapons everywhere in offense, and if the Falcons choose to eliminate Deshaun Jackson, they can. The problem that would ensue for the Falcons is that it opens up targets for a player like Ertz or any of the other offensive weapons. I don't like Deshaun this week because of how good his team is, his lack of career production against the Falcons, and his recent success that they'll want to take away. Moving on to the final player that I think regresses in Week 2 is Rams running back Malcolm Brown. Malcolm Brown had 1 career rushing touchdown heading into last week's game against Carolina. He now has 3 career rushing touchdowns heading into Week 2 against the Saints. I think the reason Malcolm will fall off this week is rather obvious, as it will take an all-out effort from every man on the Rams team to beat the Saints in what will be the first time they have played them since the NFC Championship game. I think the Rams will be trying to keep pace with the Saints in this game in terms of scoring, and that will force Jared Goff into throwing the ball a lot against him, which will inevitably leave Malcolm out. The trio of Robert Woods, Cooper Kupp, and Brandon Cooks had a combined 29 targets last week, and I expect much of the same this week, if not more. I think Malcolm will finish with around 20 to 30 rushing yards in week 2 with no touchdowns. That's all I have for today's video. I hope you enjoyed watching, and if you did, please subscribe to the channel. Again, thank you for watching, and have a great day.